How do you tell the entire history of the Jewish people in 3 volumes? Simon Schama will be here to talk about his second installment of The Story of the Jews. What tale do 12 illuminated manuscripts tell us about the medieval world? Christopher de Hamel will join us to talk about meetings with remarkable manuscripts. Alexander Alter will give us an update from the literary world. Plus, we'll talk about what we and the wider world are reading. This is Inside the New York Times Book Review. I'm Pamela Paul. Simon Schama joins us now from London. His latest book is The Story of the Jews, Volume 2, Belonging, 1492 to 1900. Simon, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So the last time we talked was actually not about Volume 1 in this series. It was a book in between that you did about British portraiture, The Face of Britain. Was that deliberate? How did that end up working out that way?
No. To my publisher's chagrin, I think, everybody imagined, and I was even in the grip of this delusion, that I could do the history of the Jews, the story of the Jews in 1 volume, Pamela. What a ridiculous idea. My great predecessor at Columbia University took 18 volumes to write it. So it was thought, because the portrait book was in conjunction with an exhibition at the National Portrait Gallery in London, that would happen after I'd closed the book, in effect, on Jewish history. It didn't happen that way. So I did the portrait book and then came back. It's called Teshuvah, which in Hebrew means both return and repentance, and that was probably true in my case. It was expected that you were going to get from 1000 BCE to the current day in how many pages and in how much time? Originally. Silly, isn't it, really? Who knows? Sort of something the size of the old Manhattan phone book, I guess. I mean, people have written. Paul Johnson wrote a very good history of Jews now, decades ago, I think, in 1 volume, but it was very, very long indeed.
Well, not as long as yours, but it moves quickly. I mean, how did you embark on this project? It's not a light undertaking, even if you had done it in 1 volume.
No, it's a bit like Jonah running away, actually, from, pointing finger, say, isn't it time to do this? I mean, when I, started being an historian, I was the kind of historian who prospered better by working on cultures that weren't my own. So that's why I did Dutch history, French history, and so on. But I'd actually wrote a book about the Rothschild family and the beginnings of Jewish resettlement in Palestine. But I felt I was kind of too close to the subject matter emotionally. But after many, many years, I thought it was sort of keeping up with writing on Jewish history. I thought it was a sort of cowardly absurdity to run away from it any longer. And I think also because Jewish history is changing in every way. There's so much cultural tumult going on inside the Jewish community about what Judaism is, what Jewish identity is, never mind the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So I really, really couldn't keep away from it any longer.
When did you write that book, Two Rothschilds and the Land of Israel?
Oh, that was in the 70s, actually. It's all you ever want to know about the origins of the avocado in Palestine. and avocado surpluses, in fact. No, I enjoyed doing it. It was based on a very particular archive. But, I had aunts and uncles who never spoke to me again as a result. And there was a certain amount of puncturing mythology, not because I like to puncture myths, but it was a book which turned out to tell a story of how much the early Jewish Yishuv, the early Jewish Zionist population in Palestine needed the diaspora in every way. And a lot of the running narrative was of self-reliance, really. So I got into trouble for that. Not that I'm scared of trouble, but I had other fish to fry, really. Gefilte fish to fry, really.
So what ultimately brought you back? When did you decide, okay, now I'm going to do this large history?
Well, it's all very pathetic. It's a classic story of old Jews, and it's not entirely, I think it may be something to do with getting old, but I started going back to synagogue. I started reading the Talmud again, and the Mishnah again, and then thinking about it. I was a religious Jew when I was small. I taught Hebrew, rather astonishingly. I grew up in an Orthodox, but not ultra-Orthodox, the difference between my father did not have sidelocks. But certainly we kept kosher. We went to synagogue every Saturday. I taught in Hebrew school. So it was really part of who I was, I think, for a long time. So it was kind of, the Jews are the most historically minded culture, certainly one of the most historically minded cultures. So it was always, it was always there, I think, actually, a kind of low melodic Hasidic thrum. And I think it's also something to do with living in New York as well. An intensely kind of Jewish, not entirely Jewish place, but
not quite
Jewish place. No, exactly. So I think all those things, and I also did feel, which describes the present book a lot, that there was some sort of Jewish history to be done, which was not just rabbis, philosophers, scholars, and nothing against, and indeed, as reviewers very kindly pointed out, rabbis, philosophers, and sages, and the usual extraordinary kind of dynasties of thinkers and writers are all there, or some of them, they're there in a powerful presence, and there's a long section on the beginnings and flourishing of Hasidism. But I thought there was also something to write about people who are usually thought of as more marginal types, like my 18th century English boxer, for example, who turns out to be the most important Jew in English history for more than a century. He changes the view of what a Jew was. He writes his autobiography. He understands what it is to invent celebrity sports identity. But he was no rabbi. So I thought that gave me a sense, well, there are other kinds of people who are outside the kind of holy aura of traditional study, but are not only not apologetic about being Jewish, but make something of it.
There are a number of characters, and not only that Georgian English boxer, but characters spread throughout the world. A general in Ming China.
Yes.
What's the story there?
Yes, that's a really extraordinary community which did eventually die out. It was so well integrated, really. It sort of disappeared at some point in the 19th century. But there was in one particular city, which goes back, it was 1 million people in the medieval period under the Northern Sung dynasty. The city was Kaifeng. Jesuits, and I tell a story of that in the 17th century, discover most extraordinarily this Jewish community living in the city of Kaifeng. And there it was possible, because really the Ming Empire basically didn't have a theology, it had a system of ethics, Confucianism. It was possible for Jews to really occupy absolutely any position. So they were mandarins, they were tax inspectors, they were teachers, and they were also quite prominent in the army. And one particular Ming general, as you say, after a disastrous siege in the middle of the 17th century, comes back to Kaifeng, and the synagogue is destroyed by flooding, and he's responsible for helping to making sure it gets rebuilt, and for recovering the Sefer Torah, the sacred scrolls, which have been scattered in the mud at the time of the disaster. And we know this from lengthy stone inscriptions which survived and seen by the Jesuits and eventually ended up in Canada. It's a really, really remarkable story.
Isn't there still a small Jewish community in this? Is it in the same place in China?
I haven't been there, actually, Pamela, but it's said to be really tiny and rather like other undercover, as it were, sort of covert communities. There's a huge one, of course, as a result of DNA testing in New Mexico and Arizona and Mexico itself, of people who've grown up impeccably Catholic, but who remember some residual ritual of grandmothers lighting candles on Friday night. And when they have DNA testing, lo and behold, they discover that they were the descendants of conversos, of Marrano converted Jews who kept up secret rites. And the same might well be true. I don't know that any DNA testing is going on in northern China. It would be extremely interesting if it did.
You end the book, roughly, with the Dreyfus Affair, and yet it isn't all about tragedy, despite the waves of anti-Semitism that run through the book. Was that deliberate? Did you want to include this sort of full spectrum of Jewish experience during this period?
Absolutely, and there are, as I say, the story in Britain is starting to turn out very well. The story in America is even despite General Grant's notorious expulsion order in the Civil War and the ups and downs of this amazing Jewish naval commodore who buys Monticello, Jefferson's house, which is truly extraordinary. What a absolute certificate of being able to belong to America. But he has to fight his way through all sorts of anti-Semitism. Despite that, it's working out. But the Dreyfus case is really horrifyingly momentous. I mean, at one particular point, you might remember there's an extraordinary anti-Semitic journalist who asked for people to subscribe to a charity which will support the widow of one of the anti-Dreyfus parties, and also to ask them what they would like to do with the Jews. What's their particular favorite form of slaughtering them? And the list is exhaustive. Turn them into dog food, make them the objects of vivisection, but that won't work because they smell too bad, burn them alive in glass furnaces, and so on. Absolutely the whole gamut of 20th century horror is recorded in that. And actually, a pro-Dreyfus writer publishes it thinking that if he publishes this horrifying catalogue of what people would like to Jews, people will be so shocked they become enthusiasts of Jews, or at least sympathetic supporters, but it doesn't work out that way at all. So it does end with Theodor Herzl and the sense of someone who is living in a city, Vienna, with an anti-Semitic mayor, of saying, this great liberal experiment is not working out. The French case is more the extraordinarily interesting issue that the fate of democracy, what a liberal republic can be, at that particular moment turns on the fate of this one Jew who's been the subject of an extraordinary miscarriage of justice. So the Jews kind of enter the bloodstream of Western civilization as a problem yet again. So that's where it ends, a bit pregnant with sorrow, I have to say.
One of the most significant non-liturgical forms of writing that you end the book with is Theodor Herzl's pamphlet, The Jewish State. Is that going to take us then into a third volume, presumably?
Yes, of course. Yes, absolutely. The big event in the early going in Chapter 3 will be the extraordinary showdown where Herzl and his friend Max Nordau, who also features at the very end of the book, think, well, we need what they call a Nachtasyl, a kind of night asylum. It would be very nice if that could be Palestine, if it could be Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, but we'll take what we can get because things are about to get extremely bad for the Jews. So there's a negotiation of maybe, Herzl takes it very far indeed, could there possibly be a Jewish state in Uganda, or could there be in El Arish, which is sort of south of the Gaza Strip? And in a Zionist Congress in 1903, the Uganda project is actually put to the Zionist Congress, and there's an enormous uproar. There's a kind of civil war inside the Zionist Congress, and it's never going to happen. And Herzl dies the year after in a kind of state of tragic distress. So the actual play between what is more important, a kind of refuge where the Jews finally can be sovereign over their own safety, or is it more important actually to have a place which is to do with the redemption of Judaism, the only place possible being Palestine itself. So that argument, of course, still very much goes on.
Very significant. Major questions then to address in the third volume.
Yeah.
And presumably
I'm both looking forward and not looking forward to that.
Maybe there'll be another book based on a National Gallery show in between then to
that would be nice.
Give you a little respite.
But don't bet on it. Yeah.
Simon, thank you so much for being here.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me, Pamela.
Simon Schama's latest book is The Story of the Jews, Belonging, 1492 to 1900. It's the second volume in his History of the Jews, which sounds like it'll be 3 volumes. Simon, thanks again.
Pleasure, Pamela. Thank you.
Christopher de Hamel joins us from London. His new book is called Meetings with Remarkable Manuscripts, 12 Journeys into the Medieval World. Christopher, thank you for being here.
That's all right. Thank you.
So this book, I have to say, because this is an audio podcast, people can't see it, is a stunning object. It's like what you want a print book to look like. It is heavy. It is thick with illustrations. It is beautifully produced. And I'm curious if in the very early stages of this book that you knew that it would need to look something like this in order to work the way it does.
I think I have to say, as the outset, no, I absolutely didn't. When we first talked about the book, and it was published in Britain by Alan Lane, Penguin, when we talked about it, they suggested, or the editor suggested, what if we do it with no illustrations whatsoever? So completely plain text. And I was rather taken with the idea. This is before I'd written any of it. It's hard to know exactly what category it falls into, but it has an element of being a travel book in that it sort of come with me, O reader, and we're off on various journeys around the world to look at and turn the pages of medieval manuscripts and to talk about them. And most travel books have relatively few pictures, or he said maybe we should have a cluster of half a dozen of them. So it wasn't intended to be an illustrated book. It wasn't intended what you describe as this luxurious object. Now, it then occurred to me once I'd handed the text in, whether this was really a trick by the publisher to try and make me write more graphically, and I haven't actually asked him that. But I think it was really an afterthought to have illustrations. I certainly wasn't expecting it.
I think it has over 200 illustrations.
Yes, it has, yeah, and I think it looks marvelous. I'm delighted with it.
But it's also a serious book and a fun one. I don't want to scare people off with serious. Tell us about the origins of this, because you look in depth at 12 different manuscripts. What is the period of time?
Well, it covers about 1,000 years of the Middle Ages, really between the fall of the Roman Empire and the High Renaissance. I am a manuscript historian. I've spent my life looking at medieval manuscripts, and one of the problems with an illuminated manuscript is they are extremely fragile and extremely precious and often enormously valuable. And so it takes as a sort of premise that the world's greatest manuscripts, and I really do mean the top end of them, the sort of Book of Kells end, are pretty inaccessible to most people. Mm-hmm. Rather like the cave paintings in Lascaux in France would be to me. I've never seen them and I never will. I'm not important enough. So the idea is really, come with me, O reader, and we're going to look at great manuscripts. And this is what it's like. This is how it's done. This is how we do it. How you get there, who you meet, how you arrange it, what you see, what it feels like when they finally put down in front of you one of the world's great books, and you start to turn the pages, and you will notice things. You'll see things that no one has ever seen before. And, I mean, that was really the idea. Then I went off to look again at all 12 manuscripts. And the book is really a record of kind of how this happens, where you see them, what the libraries are like, what you'll notice, how big they are. And as I originally kind of conceived it, and I kind of explained this in the introduction, I imagined it as being rather like an interview, appropriately in this context, because that is exactly what you are doing right now. A good interview kind of brings out things that the interviewee perhaps hardly knew or hardly expected to declare or explain. And the idea was not just a meeting with a manuscript. You can meet a famous person, but really asking them questions, looking at a book. Where was it made, and when, and why, and how, and who for, and where's it been, and why is it painted, and who did it, and how long did it take, and what's in it, and what was it for, and how big is it, and who owned it, and where's it been, how did it get to be where it is now? And those are questions you can really ask a manuscript, and the stories are often fascinating.
Well, you downplay yourself as interviewer. You might not be able to get into the caves of Lascaux, but you spent a very long career at Sotheby's, or you're now a fellow at Corpus Christi College in Cambridge. Had you encountered any of these manuscripts in those roles before, or were these first meetings?
Of the dozen books we chose for this book, yes, I'd seen most of them before. One or two I hadn't, and I then wrote off to the libraries and said, I'm planning to do this, would you allow me to come and look at these, expecting there might be the odd refusal, which would have made a marvelous copy, but in fact there wasn't. So I saw everything, but I had seen most of them before. Was
part of your desire to write about them, to encounter these manuscripts that you'd never seen before for the first time?
Well, that is part of what you try to convey. A good travel writer, will try and explain what it's like. We tend to think of all illuminated manuscripts as being just simply objects that exist. Mm-hmm. Of course, they exist in a context. It's rather like you could write about animals. You could describe an animal perfectly accurately. But to get a real picture of how an animal lives, where it lives, you want to know its habitat. You want to know the country it lives in. You want to know its landscape, its surroundings. And that, in a way, is what we've tried to convey. And I tried to choose the widest possible range. So there are two manuscripts in America, the Getty Museum in Los Angeles and the Morgan Library and Museum in New York, but also There are ones in Leiden and Copenhagen and St. Petersburg and Florence and Aberystwyth, and each one of these libraries is so different.
What do we mean by the word illuminated? What is an illuminated manuscript?
In very simple terms, manuscript is Latin, means manuscriptum, written by hand, so handwritten book. Printing was invented around 1450, and the general term, manuscript of the Middle Ages, is obviously a post-medieval term, meaning a book that's made by hand, so handmade book. Though, of course, it could apply to anything handwritten, even now. Illuminated technically means it's decorated with gold or silver, which then sparkles and catches the light, so it lights it up. And we loosely use the term illuminated manuscript, meaning any book with extensive decoration. But strictly, it should have gold or silver, and many of them do, especially gold. Gold is very, very commonly used in manuscripts. But some very, very famous books, such as the Book of Kells, technically is not illuminated in that it does not actually contain gold.
What were these encounters like? And I imagine they varied, but how much time did you have with them? Did you sit in a darkened room? Were you allowed to turn all of the pages?
It's different in each case, and that, of course, is part of the fun, and we tried to choose a selection of different kind of experiences. Looking at these are books. They're made as books. I mean, they are intended to be opened. The book as a physical artifact hasn't changed a lot in the last 1.5 millennia. Even a newspaper is not that different. It's something with pages, and you sit there and you turn the pages and you can read the text, and it operates and functions like a book. Now, of course, different libraries will have their own rules, different libraries and museums, their own rules of access and their ways of propping them open and what you get, the facilities you use or allowed to use are going to be different according to their own curators or conservators' rules and customs. But that too is part of the story, part of the experience of doing it. And there are many people who devote their lives to medieval manuscripts, and a lot of what I'm writing will be very familiar to medievalists who've traveled around these libraries. And since the book came out, people have written in saying, God, do you know, I remember that, just like that. To others, this will be a new experience. And I've often said it's rather like meeting a very, very famous person. We all pretend that everybody's the same, and of course they are, really. But there is a thrill about finding yourself in conversation with a figure of world stature. And there's a little bit of, I really get that thrill out of a great manuscript. You know all about it, you've seen it, you've read it, you've got the facsimile, you may have got the facsimile, you may have seen it on microfilm or digitized version, you may be very familiar with it. But when you get the actual object, the real thing, in your hands, and you're not just in its presence, you're really holding it, you're really touching it, you're turning its pages, you're watching its cycle go through, it has a weight, it has a size, it has a smell, it has a real physical presence.
Who is the Beyonce of the illuminated manuscript world? Like, which was the celebrity among these that you were most excited to encounter? I
suppose the most famous medieval manuscripts in existence. I mean, what is the most valuable book in the world? Kind of question. The most famous, I suppose, are probably the Book of Kells, which is late 8th century and in Trinity College, Dublin, and probably the Très Richeur of the Duke de Berry in the Musée Condé at Chantilly. That's that famous French book of ours made for the brother of the king, with that astonishing and very famous calendar at the beginning with those round-topped arches showing those, actually 11 of them, 11 of 12 original paintings done by the Limburgs, showing landscapes and showing the activities. And that very rich blue. Yes, a marvelous, marvelous manuscript. Those are probably the two most famous books in the world, probably, and I've seen both of them. One of the things about a manuscript, when you're sort of comparing it with a celebrity, is that they're not only marvelous as objects, but they belong to people. And there are manuscripts which belong to Charlemagne and St. Francis and Thomas Becket and Henry VIII and Erasmus. And I mean, the really big names of the Middle Ages owned books, and those books still exist. And you do get a real sense of reaching across the ages in holding a manuscript, turning the pages of something which was owned by King Alfred, King Athelstan.
You said that you had read before, seen before the majority of these 12 manuscripts, but tell us about one that you had not yet been in a room with and what that first encounter was like.
I had never handled, never seen out on a table, the Book of Kells or the Codex Amiatinus. Amiatinus is earlier. It's a late 7th century Bible, which is in the National Library, or one of the two national libraries in Florence, in Italy. It's an entire Bible in Latin, and it's absolutely enormous. It's called Amiatinus because it comes from a monastery called Amiata. But the extraordinary thing about it is that the manuscript is English. It's the earliest surviving manuscript of the Bible in Latin, and nearly the earliest surviving manuscript of the entire Bible in any language. And it was made in northern England. It was made in Northumbria. And I think as an English person, seeing the original of that book for the first time in extraordinary circumstances in Florence gave me a tremendous thrill. Here is a book made in the late 7th century and probably seen by the Venerable Bede, the great early English historian who writes about this manuscript. And to see that thousands of miles from where it began its journey gave me a tremendous thrill. And I'd not seen it before.
I'm going to ask a crass question now because you were at Sotheby's for so long. And how much do books like this, how much are they worth? How much are the ones that do go out on the market? How much do they go for at auction?
It's possible for anyone to own a medieval manuscript. They are not beyond the dreams of any of us. 2 minutes on eBay will pick up little fragments of 13th, 14th, 15th century books for under $100, and they're perfectly real. So that you may not want to own a fragment torn out of a book, but they are not necessarily beyond the dreams of a normal person. A complete medieval manuscript, a little 15th century book of hours, you could buy quite a nice one with illumination, but not great art, for $10,000, $20,000, about as much as perhaps as a motor car. That's perhaps the equivalent of about what they would have cost when they were new. And going right up to the top end, where a really, really grand illuminated manuscript can cost some millions, possibly even tens of millions if it was something quite extraordinary. But these are the great artworks of the Middle Ages. These are what the great painters worked on. Many of the artists known to us or most famous to us as panel painters also worked on manuscripts. So there are manuscripts illuminated by Perugino and Holbein and Raphael and Jean Fouquet and Memling and so on. And I mean, those are the top end, going right down to ones that are decorated in such a way you wonder how they ever got the job as an illuminator at all. And that's part of their charm too. So, yes, they are valuable. In the book, I end up describing one manuscript that went through Sotheby's in my time, which is the Spinola Book of Hours now in the Getty Museum, which at the time of its sale was the most expensive book ever sold. £370,000 in the 1970s. Doesn't seem to us a lot of money compared with what a great work of art is worth now, but it was a huge sum then.
All right. Well, if you're looking for the perfect gift, that last-minute holiday present, you can go out and purchase at auction one of these manuscripts or a scrap on eBay, or you could do worse than to buy this lovely book, Meetings with Remarkable Manuscripts, 12 Journeys into the Medieval World by Christopher de Hamel. Christopher, thank you so much.
It's a pleasure.
Alexandra Alter joins us now with an update from the literary world. Hi, Alexandra.
Hi, Pamela.
What's new?
So short stories are very hot. I don't know if you've heard.
One collection of short stories is certainly very hot.
Yes. So there was a really exciting publishing deal this week that everyone was waiting for. I'm sure you remember a few weeks ago, a short story went viral on The New Yorker. It attracted, I think, something like 2 million page views, and it was called Cat Person by Kristen Rupinian. This was a out-of-the-blue writer that no one had ever heard of before. She had just finished her MFA. And I think the story, because it deals with sort of awkward, semi-consensual sex and online dating and texting and this sort of fuzzy, hazy new world that we're in, Well, you read the story. What did you think of it?
You know, what struck me most is, first of all, there was a lot of humor in it that I appreciated. But I do think that it got at that awkward way in which people get to know each other in a sort of virtual and real world kind of hybrid way.
Exactly.
So that, these two people who meet when she is working at a movie theater and he's a customer who asks for, red vines that she remarks on, and they start up this kind of flirtation that quickly exits the real world and goes onto their cell phones and they're texting. So there's this intimacy in that you're sort of in the person's face at any time, and yet they don't really know each other at all. And it isn't until quite late in the story, I mean, I think perhaps after they've slept together, possibly, that she even finds out how old he is. And
exactly,
he's considerably older than her. So I just think that it captured this really odd moment that we're in terms of how people communicate and conduct relationships.
Absolutely. And I think people also seized on how well she described a particular kind of bad sex, that was sort of.
Yes. Oh my God.
It wasn't non-consensual, but she really didn't want to do it. She just felt like it was easier not to hurt his feelings, which was very well portrayed, I thought.
And also, the thing I thought she did very well was, and I think this is what resonated for a lot of women, was the fact that women in general spend so much of their time sort of anticipating and trying to intuit and interpret a man's thoughts and emotions in ways that often have no correspondence with reality. So she sort of conducts in her head entire scenarios based on what she thinks that this person is thinking, and then will switch sort of halfway through and decide, no, actually, he's hurt inside because of X, Y, and Z, and then she'll treat him in a completely different way. And none of this is based in reality. Like she, in fact, has no idea what he's thinking or feeling, and all of her reactions are exactly that, reactive.
Yeah, I definitely think that's what caused the story to become such a sensation. And apparently it was the second most read article on the New Yorker's website for all of 2017, which is pretty remarkable.
I mean, short stories in general never go viral, right?
I don't think I've ever seen that happen before. And similarly, the book deal, while not completely unprecedented, was highly unusual because with all of that attention and anticipation, the author's agent was able to go out with a collection pretty quickly after that because she had just completed her MFA and they were actually getting ready to send out a collection after the New Yorker story published. So she was able to capitalize on all that attention, and there was a huge auction, and apparently she sold the collection and another novel that's still being written for more than $1 million, apparently, in the seven figures, which is an incredible amount for a debut short story collection and really shows sort of what viral attention can do for an author in this era. And the winning publisher, after all the bids came in, was Scout Press, which is an imprint at Simon & Schuster, and they are sort of devoted to, they're fairly new, they sort of focus on commercial literary hybrids, and they're planning to publish it in 2019. And based on the description in the press release, it sounds like a really interesting collection that a lot of the other stories will sort of touch on similar themes, gender, sex, relationships, but it sounds like it's pretty loose in terms of genre. There might be some supernatural elements. It sort of sounded a little bit like Carmen Maria Machado to me, possibly, like it would appeal to her fans. So, as I was looking into whether there had been other similarly massive deals for short story collections, I think the only other ones that have sold for quite a bit of money have come from celebrities like B.J. Novak or Tom Hanks.
Well, they need the money.
And they need the money, and they need the recognition, obviously.
All right. Thanks, Alexandra.
Thanks for having me.
My colleagues John Williams, Greg Coles, and Jen Salai join us now to talk about what we're reading. Hi, guys.
Hi, Pamela.
Hi, Pamela.
All right, let's start with you, Greg. What are you reading this week?
Well, I'm going to cheat a little bit because what I'm really still reading is the Wallace Stegner novel that I talked about last week. It's a fairly sizable novel, but I don't have anything new to say about it.
Which book is that?
Angle of Repose.
Angle of Repose,
I love
exactly,
that book.
which is partly in letters. It's I will say what I didn't say last week. I've found out that it's based on actual letters and actual diaries of a woman, a frontier woman that came into Wallace Stegner's hands, and he was fascinated by her story and went to kind of recreate some of this through the novel. And so there are mining disasters, and it's this big kind of sweeping novel of the West.
I feel like there's been a kind of revival in Wallace Stegner interest lately.
Oh, it's funny. I said last week I feel like he's fallen out of favor.
No. Penguin, I think, released in paperback this year, or it may have been last year, but some nonfiction essays that he did about the American West that I brought out with me to South Dakota and was planning to read, but then it just didn't.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely reviving my interest in the literature of the West in general. And so I think that after I finish reading Angle of Repose, I will either read more Stegner, maybe the reissued, or some other Western writers. It's kind of whet my appetite for that. But at the same time, I'm reading a book that is almost out, but not quite out yet, and that's Dennis Johnson's posthumous story collection, The Largesse of the Sea Maiden. And because I know our listeners don't like it when we talk about books that they can't buy yet, I thought that instead I would talk about his first story collection and only other story collection besides The Largesse of the Sea Maiden. It's the 1990 collection, Jesus' Son, which is really a classic of our time. And so I picked that up again while I'm reading Largesse of the Sea Maiden. Dennis Johnson, for listeners who haven't read him before, he was very prolific. He died in the beginning of this year of liver cancer. He wrote poetry, he wrote plays, he wrote novels. He won the National Book Award for his novel Tree of Smoke, which was a big kind of sprawling Vietnam novel that was kind of a prequel. It followed the same character as the protagonist of his very first novel called Angels, which came out in
I love that book.
1980. Oh, Angels is great. Very different novel from Tree of Smoke. It's not sprawling at all. It's this very kind of tightly. It's a road trip. It's a Greyhound bus trip across America with this damaged Vietnam vet. And then in Tree of Smoke, we find out what he went through in Vietnam. But Jesus' Son is a collection of linked stories, all from the point of view of this one protagonist with a name I can't I cannot say on the air. But he's a drug addict, an alcoholic. The most famous story in Jesus' Son, which I've written about before on our website, is a story called Emergency, just really a great story. But the book opens with a story called Car Crash While Hitchhiking. And the whole premise of the story is there in the title. It opens with him hitchhiking. A family in an Oldsmobile picks him up. He knows he's stoned out of his mind on drugs that other drivers have been giving him during his hitchhiking journey. And he knows even before he gets in this car that they are fated to crash, and they do. There's a baby in the car, and he kind of wanders off holding the baby and flags down a truck driver, asks for help, asks the truck driver to watch the baby. So you're kind of watching in
slow motion.
In slow motion, like, oh my
Nightmare.
God. Yeah, exactly. But the writing is so beautiful. I'll just read this one paragraph from Car Crash, which is, "The man hanging out of the wrecked car was still alive as I passed, and I stopped, grown a little more used to the idea now of how really badly broken he was, and made sure there was nothing I could do. He was snoring loudly and rudely. His blood bubbled out of his mouth with every breath. He wouldn't be taking many more. I knew that, but he didn't, and therefore I looked down into the great pity of a person's life on this earth. I don't mean that we all end up dead. That's not the great pity. I mean that he couldn't tell me what he was dreaming, and I couldn't tell him what was real." And then I'll jump forward to the end, which is a flash forward to a time when he's admitted into a hospital for detox, and he's again stoned out of his mind and hallucinating all kinds of things at the hospital. He says the boxes of cotton are talking to him and that kind of thing. "How did the room get so white?" I asked. A beautiful nurse was touching my skin. "These are vitamins," she said, and drove the needle in. It was raining. Gigantic ferns leaned over us. The forest drifted down a hill. I could hear a creek rushing down among rocks. And you ridiculous people, you expect me to help you. And then it fades out.
Much of the book is like that, hallucinatory.
It's very hallucinatory.
It's
It's kind of, I mean, it's called Jesus' Son, and there is this strain of not quite religion, but certainly kind of a transcendent mysticism to the whole thing. Jesus' Son, you learn in an epigraph, it's a quote from Lou Reed from the song Heroin. So it's all, you get the drugs, you get the religion, all right there. That's not what I've been reading, but that's what I chose to talk about on today's podcast. Jen, what have you been reading?
So I picked up this book by Ted Chiang. It's called Stories of Your Life and Others. And maybe some of our listeners saw the movie that was based on one of the stories in this book, which was Arrival, which I think came out.
Oh, yeah.
Which was made into the movie.
Right.
It was made
into my college.
Yeah. Oh, you did?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Did you go at the same time?
No, if I did, I didn't know him, which describes pretty much everyone I went to school with.
And so Arrival, which I can't now remember if it came out this past year or the year before. Okay, then this makes sense because apparently this collection first came out in 2002. And so he's not a prolific writer. You were talking about Dennis Johnson being prolific. I think Ted Chiang is the opposite of that. For a living, he's a technical writer. I think he got his degree in computer science. And so,
another reason why we didn't know each other.
Well, there you go. And so, I think just over the years, over a couple of decades, he's written these stories that have, won awards in the science fiction community. And he's very much respected, but I think this might be his only collection. And so they reissued it in 2016, probably to coincide with Arrival. The story that Arrival is based on is one of the longer stories in the book. And it's always interesting when you actually see a film first, especially one like that, which I thought was an incredible film. But I couldn't imagine what the source material was like, just because I don't want to give anything away, but the film turns out to be something you totally don't expect. Ostensibly, it's about this linguist who's brought in by the government to essentially try to communicate with these alien life forms that have landed on Earth. But then by the end of the film, it turns into something that's just totally different and just very sort of
imaginative.
Well, very imaginative, but also heart-wrenching, very humane. And just totally upended what I was expecting, I think, when I went in to see the movie. And so to see how the story sort of begins, and there's like a certain amount of information that seems, at least to me, clearer at the beginning of the story that only becomes clear at the end of the movie. So it's just a very different experience so far. But it is also incredibly moving. I'm about halfway through that story, and then I read a couple others in the book, and it just, I don't read that much science fiction, so it's always interesting to me when I do. And I know that probably science fiction fans are, well aware of how gigantic the questions are that are often addressed in science fiction, but it's always nice to sort of come to it and see, oh, okay, these are enormous questions, and they're really being worked through. Yeah.
Jen, you're squeezing all your fiction in now before you start as our nonfiction critic
I know,
next
that's
year,
right.
which we'll hear much more about in 2018.
Yes.
But until then, are you still on your Cormac McCarthy quest?
I did start another Cormac McCarthy book, of course, but I'm not going to say anything about it because it's a long one, and I just started it, so there's not much to say yet. I'll say it in 2018. And
I'm going to save it for like the next 4 podcasts.
You're not even going to tell us what
and
it
I'm
is?
still reading. I'm not even going to say what it is, and I'm still reading. It's the next one, so if people are following chronologically with me, they'll know it.
I'm going to get angry emails now.
It's a novel called Suttree, and it's his 4th book, and it's bigger than the first 3, so I've got to bring it with me on vacation and really hunker down. And I'm still reading L.F. Botchman's The Idiot, which I talked about last week, and which I'm greatly enjoying. It's just
what are you up to?
Very delightful on every page. What am I up to? I'm fairly early still. She's teaching underprivileged people to try to get their GEDs, and they're not having it. And she's sort of flirting with this guy over email. She's just discovered that she can access this guy's email, so she's starting to write to him. It's a very funny book. And then I just thought I would very briefly mention, because I kind of went back this week to one of my favorite books, which is William James's The Varieties of Religious Experience, which I wrote about for the paper this week. And,
those of you who are podcast-only people, take the time to read this essay. It's beautiful.
That's nice. Pamela, what about you?
Well, I finished Operation Mincemeat by Ben McIntyre earlier this week. The subtitle is How a Dead Man and a Bizarre Plan Fooled the Nazis and Assured an Allied Victory. And this was the story about a British plot in which they took the dead body of basically a unmourned laborer from Wales and disguised it as a naval officer and plopped it into the ocean off the coast of Spain, where it was holding a bunch of documents that would deceive, hopefully, the Axis forces into believing that, contrary to all expectation, a 1943 invasion by the Allies would take place not in Sicily, but anywhere else. And so there was a whole elaborate scheme concocted. The idea was that Francoist parties in Spain would get these papers over to the Germans so that they would fall for this plot. And they took this body and they concocted this elaborate backstory around this naval officer, William Martin. He even had a fiance. They had photos of the fiance. They had love letters written between them. With a guy who was sort of like came up with this idea, pretended to be William Martin, took out this young secretary from the same office who was pretending to be William Martin's girlfriend, and they would like go out at night pretending to be these two people that did not exist. And there were all kinds of logistical hurdles, the most macabre, which were dealing with this body, which was not, in fact, a body that died by drowning after falling out of an airplane, but instead had died from self-inflicted poisoning several months earlier and was sort of being pickled and preserved and kept in cold places in London until they could ship him off on a submarine. And the people on the submarine, of course, couldn't know about this secret plot. So he was just kind of in this like missile-shaped tube. And they were told that, these were optical instruments. It's a very good story, and there's lots of little side plots and many, many, many characters. I focused on the really ghoulish ones of, the early pathology science and sort of what they knew, what they could tell at that time to determine the cause of death, and the fact that this body that was in fact 3 months dead, they were trying to pass off as a few days drowned. And I'll leave it at that. It's just, you can imagine that the body, when it was discovered, the face was half eaten away by mold. Anyway, it's a good book. I think that among the McIntyre books that I've read, I still prefer A Spy Among Friends. That book, in a way, there was so much in that story about Kim Philby and the Cambridge Five and that whole spy ring. And that story had been told many times. And so the trick, I think, that McIntyre had, the challenge in that story was to kind of keep it narrow and focused enough. Whereas this, it was almost the opposite challenge. Like, you did have this one kind of a crazy elaborate spy maneuver, but probably not enough in and of itself to carry an entire book. So what he does is kind of the opposite. Instead of strategically leaving things out, he kind of weaves in some interesting side stories. But at certain points, you feel like a little bit like it becomes kind of filler, and there's so many characters, it's a little hard to keep track of. But I enjoyed it. And I've started another book, very different, that was given to me by an editor in Sydney, Australia, when I was there in the spring. And I think she slipped it to me sort of, I think she said, you really need to read some more Australian fiction. And here's just an example of what we can do here. And that's by Kate Grenville. And the book is called The Secret River. I don't know if any of you read this book.
I haven't read The Secret River, but I have read some Kate Grenville before.
Oh, really? So she's like a historical novelist.
Yeah, quite good, kind of traditional historical novels, beautiful, quiet, and very Australian.
Yes, very Australian. Well, once you go to Australia, and has anyone here been to Australia? No. So I'd never been to Australia either. You're like, oh, wow, there's this whole world over here on the other side and the upside down of our globe. And they have their whole thing going on, and we just don't hear about it because we're so far away, including a really thriving literary community and publishing industry. And you go into the bookstores there, and there are just, shelves and shelves of Australian fiction of people that maybe you've heard of some of them. Obviously, they do tend to get over here, but not all. And when you leave, I mean, for me, other than having read The Fatal Shore, the Robert Hughes book about Australia's founding many years ago, I really did not know that much about Australian history. And there are such interesting parallels but also distinctions between our own history and the whole story of colonization there and the treatment of the indigenous peoples. And I think this book, The Secret River, is in part about Grenville sort of grappling with and fictionalizing her own past and how her ancestors came to Australia. And so it starts off in the early 19th century with a man named William Thornhill, who's been sent there as a prisoner to the penal colony in New South Wales, and then flashes back quickly to his childhood, which is just of total Dickensian deprivation, very vividly rendered, of just being one child among many with never enough to eat, sleeping in a bed with a shared blanket and no heat and bed bugs, and what it's like growing up in a family where it's not that the parents are indifferent, but they're overworked and underfed and sick, and nobody knows whose birthday it is ever. So it starts off on a grim note, which I enjoy. And with that, happy holidays all.
To you too.
Thanks.
Thanks, Pamela.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books, and you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. Inside the New York Times Book Review is produced by Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.